As 16-year-old Micah Rivers walked through the dark streets of Lansford Heights after another exhausting shift, he felt the familiar ache in his bones, a weight that had settled over him ever since his mother, Etta Mae, had fallen ill. Secretly working multiple jobs to pay for her medical bills, he was willing to sacrifice everything to give her a chance at a better life. But he kept it hidden. If she knew how much he was taking on, her heart would break. Day after day, he balanced school, work, and worry, clinging to the dream that he could make things right for both of them. Just as hope seemed farthest from reach, fate brought an unexpected ally into Micah's life. Mr. Otis, a kind-hearted businessman who recognized the young man's grit and determination. Through small gestures at first, Mr. Otis quietly offered Micah a lifeline, a better-paying job and guidance that would change his world. Over time, Micah grew from a struggling teenager into a young leader, learning the ropes of business and finally building the life he and his mother had only dared to dream of. Together they created a community-focused business that thrived, giving back to the very neighborhood that had lifted him when he needed it most. As he looked around at his success, surrounded by friends and family, Micah realized he hadn't just survived, he had built a legacy rooted in love, resilience, and the power of community. If Micah's story of hope, grit, and unexpected opportunity resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. The streetlights flickered as 16-year-old Micah Rivers walked down the cracked pavement of Lansford Avenue, his last stop before home. It was close to midnight, and the chill in the air sank through his thin, worn-out hoodie, but Micah hardly noticed. After all, he was used to these cold, late walks. 3 jobs, 3 shifts, 6 days a week. That was his life now. And no one knew about it, not even his mother. Micah slowed his steps as he neared his apartment building. The sight of it, a weather-beaten, grey, crumbling structure with only a few lights on, always made his chest tighten. His mother, Etta Mae Rivers, lived on the 2nd floor. She'd be fast asleep by now, or at least that's what he hoped. He couldn't risk her staying up and noticing him coming in at this hour, or the exhaustion in his eyes. He stopped by the narrow alley next to the building, tugging off the greasy diner cap from his shift at Mason's Diner. After a quick look around, he stuffed it into his backpack, burying it under his textbooks and the tattered notebook he used to study whenever he could find a free moment. No one could know what he was doing, least of all Etta Mae. She'd never understand, he murmured to himself, thinking of her reaction if she found out. Etta Mae was proud. She was stubborn. She believed in working hard but wanted him to focus on his education, not on scraping together bills. When he finally reached the apartment door, he twisted the knob as quietly as possible and eased it open, stepping inside on his toes to avoid the squeaky floorboards. The air was filled with the familiar scent of lavender and honey, a scent that came from the homemade candles Etta Mae used to make before her health started declining. He glanced down the narrow hallway toward her room. The door was closed, and the dim light spilling out from underneath told him she'd likely fallen asleep reading. The soft hum of jazz, her favorite music, was barely audible, a sure sign she'd drifted off. Micah closed his eyes for a moment, relief washing over him. He'd managed to slip in undetected, at least tonight. After leaving his shoes and bag near the door, he slipped into the tiny kitchen and grabbed a glass of water. The cracked ceiling and peeling paint used to bother him, but not anymore. Now he only cared about one thing: making sure they could keep this apartment, that they could survive the harsh reality of life in Lansford Heights. For Etta Mae, Micah would do anything, even if it meant giving up his own future. As he took a long sip, Micah thought of his mother's smile, a warm, tired smile that had stayed with him since childhood. She was a fighter, he reminded himself, even if life had taken so much from her. Once, before she became sick, she'd been a talented jazz singer, well loved in their small town. Her voice could soothe any heart, no matter how weary. But now, those days seemed as distant as the stars in the sky. That was why Micah couldn't let her find out he was working himself to exhaustion. She'd want him to stop, and they couldn't afford it. Not with the mounting medical bills, not with rent due every month, and certainly not with her pride. Micah could still hear her voice telling him, "Baby, I worked too hard for you to give up on school. You're going to be someone, Micah. You're going to change the world." But she didn't know the half of what he'd been doing just to keep their world from crumbling. He was still deep in thought when the sound of footsteps made him jump. He whipped around, clutching the glass so hard it nearly slipped from his hand. In the hallway, his mother stood, her figure slouched, but her gaze was sharp and full of suspicion. "Micah?" Etta Mae's voice was soft, but there was an edge of worry in it. "What are you doing up so late?" Micah froze, swallowing hard. He'd been careful, so careful, but the exhaustion was making him sloppy. I just got thirsty," he mumbled, setting the glass down. His voice felt small, almost guilty, and he tried to avoid her eyes. "I thought you'd be asleep by now." Etta Mae folded her arms, leaning against the wall. Her face was thin, tired, but her eyes still held that fierce protectiveness he knew so well. "You've been coming home late a lot lately," she said, her gaze piercing. "I hear you sneaking in. You think I don't notice?" Micah's heart pounded, and he shifted his weight, trying to come up with an excuse. I was just studying late at the library," he stammered, knowing she wouldn't believe him. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Micah, don't lie to me. I know you're doing something more than studying. You look worn out, baby." Her voice softened, concern taking over her usual sternness. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" No, it's nothing like that, Mama," he said quickly, shaking his head. "I swear I'm just trying to help." For a moment, they stood there in silence, a deep, unspoken understanding hanging between them. Micah could feel her eyes on him, filled with a mixture of worry, suspicion, and love. The weight of it made his chest ache. He didn't want to keep secrets from her, but he didn't want to be the reason she worried even more. Finally, Etta Mae spoke, her tone resigned but firm. "Micah, you're still young. You need to be focusing on your studies, not whatever this is." Micah forced a smile, hoping to ease her mind. "I know, Mama. I'm fine. I just want to make things easier for you." Etta Mae's eyes softened. She reached out and gently cupped his cheek. "You're a good boy, Micah. But don't lose yourself trying to be my savior." "I don't need saving. I just need you to be happy." Micah nodded, swallowing back the tightness in his throat. But as she turned to go back to her room, he clenched his fists, determined. This wasn't about him, it was about survival. And he'd keep doing whatever it took, even if she never found out the truth. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Micah's bedroom, casting a soft glow over the cluttered room. Micah groaned as he forced himself up, every muscle in his body protesting from the hours of labor he'd put in the day before. But he didn't have time to dwell on the aches. He'd made a promise to himself, one he'd keep no matter what. He quickly got ready, slipping into a hoodie and jeans before shoving his textbooks and work uniform into his worn backpack. The sound of soft humming floated down the hall. It was Etta Mae, already awake, likely preparing her morning tea and playing one of her old jazz records to fill the quiet of the apartment. Micah knew her morning routine well. She didn't have much energy for chores, but she liked to wake up before him, humming as she brewed her tea, the kitchen warm with the smell of chamomile and honey. Micah found her by the small kitchen table, her slender fingers wrapped around a chipped teacup. She looked up, her warm brown eyes meeting his, a tired but loving smile forming on her lips. Her once full, rich hair was now graying, framing her face in soft, loose curls. "Morning, baby," she said, giving him a nod toward the seat across from her. "Come sit. Made a little oatmeal for you before school." Micah's heart swelled with affection. No matter how sick she felt, Etta Mae always found a way to care for him. He took a seat, picking up the small bowl of oatmeal she'd made, though his stomach was tight with thoughts of what lay ahead. "Thank you, Mama," he murmured, taking a spoonful to ease her watchful eyes. Etta Mae sipped her tea, her gaze steady. "You look tired, honey. You sure you're sleeping okay?" "Yeah, Mama. Just, lots of studying." "Yeah, Mama. Just, lots of studying." Micah swallowed, feeling the weight of her words. He wanted to reassure her, tell her he could handle it, but he didn't want to lie, so he simply nodded, forcing a smile. "I know, Mama. I'm fine. I promise, Etta." Mae looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to read the thoughts behind his smile, but she let it go. "Well, all right then," she said finally, patting his hand. "Just make sure you get to class on time." Micah finished his oatmeal and gave her a kiss on the forehead, inhaling the familiar scent of lavender that clung to her. He made his way to the door, waving to her as he stepped out into the chilly morning air. The walk to school was a quiet one, each step echoing in the empty streets. Micah's school, Harper High, was a modest brick building at the end of Lansford Avenue. Inside, students filed into classrooms, laughing and talking about the weekend, their voices blending into a lively hum that contrasted sharply with Micah's weary silence. Micah kept his head down, making his way to his locker to switch out his textbooks. Just as he reached for his locker door, he heard a familiar voice. "Yo, Micah!" called Jeremiah, his best friend since middle school, a tall, lanky kid with a warm smile and boundless energy. "You good, man? You look like you stayed up all night studying for that math test." Micah forced a grin. "Something like that." He opened his locker, shoving in his books as Jeremiah leaned against the next locker over, watching him closely. "You don't have to be all secretive, bro," Jeremiah said, his voice quieter, more serious. "I know you've been doing something after school and it's not just studying. You can tell me." Micah hesitated, glancing down at his locker. Jeremiah was the only person he'd ever trusted with his struggles, but he still couldn't bring himself to tell him everything. Not yet. "It's nothing, man. Just trying to help my mom out," Micah replied, his voice low. Jeremiah sighed, his face softening with understanding. "All right, I get it. But don't forget you got people who care about you too, Micah. You don't have to carry everything on your own." Micah's shoulders eased slightly, grateful for Jeremiah's support, even if he couldn't tell him the full truth. He nodded, slamming his locker shut and giving Jeremiah a fist bump. "Thanks, man." They walked to class together, Jeremiah chatting about the upcoming basketball game, but Micah's mind was elsewhere. He knew he was running himself thin, but he couldn't stop. Not with the bills piling up, not with his mother's health hanging in the balance. That night, after school, and another grueling shift at the grocery store, Micah found himself back at Mason's diner, his last job of the day. The smell of fried onions and burgers filled the air as he scrubbed down tables, the sounds of the late-night crowd buzzing around him. He was exhausted, every muscle in his body aching, but he pushed through, determined to make it through his shift. As he worked, he noticed an elderly man at the corner booth, dressed in a worn suit with a kind face lined with age. The man had been nursing a cup of coffee for the better part of an hour, and Micah had seen him slip a few extra napkins into his coat pocket, glancing around to make sure no one noticed. Feeling a pang of empathy, Micah approached him with a warm smile. "You need a refill, sir?" The man looked up, his eyes tired but grateful. "Thank you, son. I'd appreciate it." Micah poured him another cup, and as he did, the man offered him a smile. "You work hard, don't you, young man?" Micah chuckled, shrugging. "Guess you could say that. Gotta do what you gotta do, right?" The man nodded thoughtfully, his gaze lingering on Micah. "It's a good thing you're doing. People don't always see the sacrifice in others, but I see it. You're a good kid." Micah felt a swell of pride at the man's words. He nodded in thanks, then turned back to his duties. But as he finished his shift, he found himself thinking of the old man's words, a strange feeling settling in his chest, a mixture of pride and a weariness that he couldn't shake. As he walked home that night, he looked up at the stars, feeling the weight of his responsibilities heavier than ever. And yet he knew he couldn't stop. Not now, not when his mother needed him most. The next morning, Micah woke before dawn, his body protesting as he pulled himself out of bed. The apartment was still dark and silent, and he knew his mother wouldn't be awake for hours. This early shift was one he dreaded, but he couldn't afford to miss it. Every dollar counted, and the grocery store job, though tiring, paid a little extra for pre-opening hours. Micah dressed quickly, pausing at his mother's door. He could hear her soft breathing, a comforting sound. She'd had a bad night coughing, and he'd lain awake in the next room, listening and feeling helpless. He slipped out quietly, grabbing an old thermos of coffee he'd prepared the night before. The streets were empty as he made his way to the grocery store. The sun had yet to rise, and a damp fog blanketed the road. Each step felt heavy, his mind wandering back to the diner and the old man he'd served last night. Something about him had stayed with Micah. The man's worn coat, the glimmer of kindness in his tired eyes. It was rare to find kindness among strangers, and it had sparked something in Micah. But he pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the tasks awaiting him at the store. Micah's boss at the grocery store, Mr. Calloway, was a gruff, middle-aged man with a sharp eye for detail. He had little patience for laziness, and Micah had quickly learned to stay on his good side by working twice as hard and speaking as little as possible. "Rivers," Mr. Calloway barked the moment Micah entered the stockroom. "You're on aisle duty. Stock the canned goods and clean up the mess someone left there yesterday. You're late, so no breaks until you're done." Micah nodded, murmuring an apology, as he grabbed a box of cans and headed to the aisle. The work was mind-numbing, and as he stacked can after can, his thoughts drifted back to his mother. He hated leaving her alone in the mornings, hated that her illness had trapped them in this constant cycle of worry. But every can he stacked, every hour he clocked, it was all for her. For keeping their home, her medications, and some small hope that maybe things would get better. The morning passed slowly, his muscles aching as he finished the aisle. Just as he was about to leave, Mr. Calloway appeared, inspecting the shelves with a frown. "You missed a spot," he said, tapping his foot impatiently. Micah clenched his jaw, feeling the exhaustion weigh on him, but he nodded, grabbing a cloth to wipe down the shelves again, his hands moving quickly, carefully. When Mr. Calloway finally walked away, Micah allowed himself a quick breath, rubbing his tired eyes. He had another shift to get to right after this one, but he couldn't afford to show any weakness, at least not here. As he finished up, a quiet voice broke through his thoughts. "You're Micah Rivers, right?" Micah looked up, startled. A girl about his age, stood there, holding a few items in her hands. She had deep brown eyes, and he recognized her from school, a new student, if he remembered right. "Oh, yeah," he said, caught off guard. "I think I've seen you around Harper High. You're new, right?" She smiled, giving him a small nod. "That's right. I'm Althea Brooks. Nice to meet you." "Nice to meet you too," Micah replied, surprised that anyone from school would recognize him outside of class. His job was his private world, one he kept hidden from his classmates. Althea's gaze lingered on him, a thoughtful expression in her eyes. "I saw you helping that older man at the diner last night. That was really kind of you." Micah's cheeks warmed. He hadn't noticed anyone watching him last night, and the idea of being seen made him uncomfortable. "Oh, it was nothing really. Just doing my job." Althea smiled again, but it was softer, like she understood more than she let on. "Not everyone would go out of their way like that. I think it's a good thing." Micah shrugged, unsure of how to respond. "Thanks. Guess I just believe people should look out for each other, you know." Althea nodded, her gaze shifting, as if she was considering something. "Well, if you ever need help with anything, let me know. Sometimes it's good to have people to rely on." He didn't know why her words struck him so deeply. Maybe it was because he hadn't let anyone close to him in so long, or because Althea seemed genuine, like she'd seen more than just the tired grocery store worker he'd become. "Thanks, Althea," he said quietly. "I appreciate that." They exchanged a small, warm look before she walked away, leaving Micah to finish his shift with a bit more lightness in his heart. That afternoon, Micah headed to his next job at the mechanic's shop. His boss there, Earl, was rough around the edges but decent enough, and he'd taken a liking to Micah's hard-working attitude. Earl often teased him, calling him the kid with more jobs than hands, but he paid fairly and didn't mind if Micah left early when he needed to. By the time he arrived at the shop, his hands were already raw from the morning shift, but he pushed through, grateful for the distraction that work offered. Earl waved him over as soon as he walked in, handing him a heavy wrench. "Afternoon, Micah," Earl grunted. "Got a big job for you today. You think you're up for it?" Micah nodded, taking the wrench. "Of course. What do you need?" Earl smirked, giving him a friendly pat on the shoulder. "Good. We got a busted old Buick out back. Needs a full inspection and oil change. Think you can handle it?" "Absolutely," Micah replied, already moving toward the car. He'd worked on enough cars by now to feel at home with grease-stained hands, and there was something comforting about fixing something with his own two hands. As he worked, his thoughts wandered back to his mother, to the way her face had lit up when he'd managed to buy her that small jazz record last month. He remembered the joy in her eyes, the way she'd clutched the record like a precious treasure. Moments like that made all his exhaustion feel worth it. Earl walked over a while later, watching him with an approving nod. "You're good at this, kid. Ever thought about making this more than a part-time thing?" Micah forced a small smile, shaking his head. "Maybe someday. Right now, just trying to make ends meet." Earl chuckled, crossing his arms. "I get it. But if you ever want more hours, you let me know. You got potential, Micah." "Thanks, Earl," Micah said, surprised by the compliment. "I'll keep that in mind." As evening approached, he finally finished his work on the Buick, hands aching but satisfied. He cleaned up and grabbed his things, giving Earl a wave as he headed back out into the fading daylight. Back home, the apartment was quiet as usual, the only sound coming from the soft hum of jazz from his mother's record player. Micah found Etta Mae sitting on the couch, her legs tucked under her, humming along to the music with her eyes closed. "Hey, Mama!" he greeted softly, walking over and placing a gentle kiss on her head. She opened her eyes, giving him a smile that instantly melted away the day's weariness. "Micah, honey, you're home. How was school?" "It was all right," he replied, sitting down next to her. "How are you feeling?" She gave a small, nonchalant wave, brushing it off. "I'm fine, baby. Don't you go worrying about me." But Micah noticed the tightness around her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped with fatigue. He knew she'd never admit it, but her condition was taking a toll on her, even if she tried to hide it from him. "Mama, I was thinking," he began cautiously. "Maybe I could help out more around here, you know? Like, with whatever you need." She looked at him, her eyes softening with a mixture of pride and sadness. "Micah, I don't want you thinking you've got to carry all this weight, honey. You're young. You should be out there, living your life, not worrying over an old woman like me." "You're not old," he said firmly, "and I want to help. You've done so much for me. I just want to make sure you're okay." Etta Mae reached over, squeezing his hand. "You're such a good boy, Micah. But I need you to promise me something, okay? Promise me you'll go after your dreams no matter what. Don't let this situation keep you from the future you deserve." Micah looked down, feeling the weight of her words settle deep in his heart. He wanted to promise, but he also knew the reality they lived in. His dreams could wait. She was his priority now. "I'll try, Mama," he whispered, squeezing her hand back. "I promise I'll try." As they sat there, holding hands, the music played softly in the background, filling the room with the warm, soulful notes of a life they both dreamed of but could hardly reach. And for that brief moment, Micah felt a sliver of peace, even as the weight of his choices pressed down on him. Later that evening, Micah lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, his mind too restless for sleep. The conversation with his mother lingered, her words replaying in his head. Etta Mae had never asked for anything from him except to focus on his studies, to stay out of trouble, and to build a future beyond the small confines of their lives in Lansford Heights. But with the pile of bills growing on the kitchen counter, he couldn't see any future without stepping up now. In the morning, Micah was up early, his backpack slung over one shoulder, as he left the apartment. Outside, Jeremiah was waiting, leaning against the fence with his signature grin. "Thought you'd head out without me, huh?" Jeremiah said, giving him a playful punch on the arm. "Come on, man, walk with me." They strolled along the cracked sidewalk, passing the small stores and worn buildings that had become so familiar. Jeremiah's light-hearted chatter kept Micah distracted, and for a while he could almost forget the weight of his responsibilities. Almost. "So, you're working at that diner still, huh?" Jeremiah said casually, but his gaze was sharp. Micah paused, sensing where this conversation was headed. He nodded, keeping his tone even. "Yeah, got a few hours in after school." "Hours, huh?" Jeremiah raised an eyebrow. "I get it, man. You're looking out for your mom and all, but don't you think she'd want you to take care of yourself too?" Micah's mouth tightened. Jeremiah had a way of seeing through his defenses, and he didn't want to get into it right now. "I'm fine, Jay," he said, brushing it off. "It's no big deal." "Yeah? Doesn't look like it?" Jeremiah's tone softened. "Look, I know you're doing this for her, but she'd hate it if she knew what it was doing to you." Micah forced a smile, nodding along. "It's temporary, that's all. Things'll get easier soon." Jeremiah nodded, but there was doubt in his eyes. He knew Micah was carrying more than he was willing to admit, but he also knew when to let things go. They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, and for that, Micah was grateful. That afternoon, Micah found himself back at Mason's diner, slipping into his apron as the familiar sounds of clattering dishes and sizzling grills filled the air. The scent of fried food, coffee and cigarette smoke felt like home by now. Just as he was starting his shift, he spotted a familiar face, a man sitting in the corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee. It was the same elderly man from the other night, Mr. Otis. Micah was both surprised and pleased to see him again. He approached the table, greeting the man with a smile. "Afternoon, Mr. Otis. Didn't think I'd see you around here again so soon." Mr. Otis looked up, a warm, worn smile creasing his face. "You remember me, huh? You're a good kid, Micah." Micah chuckled. "Well, you left an impression. What brings you back here?" Mr. Otis took a slow sip of his coffee before responding. "I got a lot of time these days. Used to be I'd be running around town for work, meetings, travel. Now, well, I mostly just watch people, think about life." Something about Mr. Otis's words struck a chord in Micah. Here was a man who had clearly lived through his own trials and seemed at peace with where he was. Micah felt a sudden urge to ask for advice, to share a bit of his burden, but he stopped himself. Instead, he kept his tone light. "Bet that's kind of nice, though. You get to just be. Not as nice as you'd think." Mr. Otis's smile faded slightly, and he looked at Micah with a hint of seriousness. "People think having money makes life easier, but sometimes it makes things a whole lot harder. You think it gives you control, but in the end, you realize it doesn't make you invincible." Micah tilted his head, curious. "You were in business?" "Once upon a time." Mr. Otis chuckled. "Back in the day, I did all right for myself. Had a little company, did some investing, but somewhere along the way I lost sight of what mattered." He paused, his gaze distant. "Now I look at young folks like you working so hard, and I think maybe it's time I give back a bit." Micah shifted uncomfortably, unsure where the conversation was headed. "Well, it's nice of you to say that, sir. Guess some people just have to work hard to make it, you know?" Mr. Otis nodded, watching him closely. "I can see you got that in you, Micah. You got a good heart, a strong mind. I see how you handle yourself, even in here." Micah felt a strange warmth at the compliment, but he quickly brushed it off. "Thanks, Mr. Otis. I appreciate it. I just do what I can." Mr. Otis's gaze didn't waver. "You ever need help, you let me know. Might not look like much, but I still got a few connections around this town." Micah forced a smile, nodding politely. "I'll keep that in mind, sir." "Thank you." A few days later, Micah was making his way home after a particularly long shift when he felt a sharp pain in his stomach. He tried to ignore it, but it grew more intense with every step until he was nearly doubled over, struggling to catch his breath. He leaned against a lamp-post, breathing heavily as a wave of dizziness washed over him. "You all right there, young man?" a voice called from nearby. Micah looked up, and to his surprise, he saw Mr. Otis standing a few feet away, watching him with concern. "Mr. Otis, what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," Mr. Otis replied, his gaze sharp. "You don't look well. Come on, sit down a minute." Reluctantly, Micah allowed Mr. Otis to lead him over to a nearby bench. He sat down, clutching his stomach, as the pain slowly began to subside. "Been pushing yourself too hard, haven't you?" Mr. Otis asked, his voice gentle but firm. "I see it all the time in kids like you, working too much, not taking care of yourself." Micah managed a weak smile. "Guess you could say that. Just got a lot on my plate, that's all." Mr. Otis's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on Micah's shoulder. "Listen, son, you got to take care of yourself, or you won't be any good to anyone else." Micah looked down, feeling a pang of guilt. He knew Mr. Otis was right, but he couldn't stop. Not when his mother's health and their home depended on it. "I don't really have a choice," he murmured. "My mum, she's not well and we got bills piling up. If I don't work, we lose everything." Mr. Otis was silent for a moment, his face thoughtful. Finally, he nodded. "I respect that, Micah. But even the strongest tree can fall if it's not cared for. You can't keep doing this alone. Promise me you'll at least let people help you when they offer." Micah nodded reluctantly. He knew Mr. Otis meant well, and deep down, he appreciated the concern. "Thank you, Mr. Otis. I'll keep that in mind." They sat in silence for a moment, and Micah felt a sense of peace settle over him. He hadn't expected to find an ally in a stranger, but Mr. Otis's kindness and wisdom were a balm to his weary soul. Before they parted, Mr. Otis handed Micah a small business card with his contact information. "If you ever need anything, you give me a call, all right? And I mean it, Micah. Don't be too proud." Micah took the card, slipping it into his pocket with a quiet nod. "I'll remember that. Thanks, Mr. Otis." They said their goodbyes, and Micah made his way home, feeling a little lighter. But as he stepped into the apartment and saw his mother asleep on the couch, a blanket tucked around her thin frame, he felt the weight of his responsibilities settle over him again. He couldn't stop working. Not yet. Over the next few weeks, life fell into a routine of school, work, and the fleeting moments he spent with his mother. Micah was exhausted, but he pushed through each day, focusing on his goal. But one night, everything came crashing down. It was past midnight, and he had just returned from his shift at the diner. The apartment was dark, and a strange silence filled the air. As he made his way down the hall, he noticed a faint light coming from his mother's room. He felt a pang of unease, a sense that something was wrong. He opened the door and found her lying on the bed, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Panic gripped him, and he rushed to her side, shaking her gently. "Mama," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Mama, wake up." Etta Mae's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him, her gaze hazy. "Micah, honey." Her voice was weak, barely a whisper, and Micah felt a surge of fear. He fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. Within minutes, the paramedics arrived, rushing her to the hospital. Micah rode in the ambulance, his heart pounding as he held her hand, praying silently. He couldn't lose her. Not now. As they reached the hospital, the doctors took her into the emergency room, leaving him in the waiting area, his mind racing. He felt helpless, overwhelmed by a fear he couldn't shake. And in that moment, he remembered Mr. Otis's card in his pocket. With a shaky hand, he pulled it out and dialed the number. It rang once, twice, before a familiar voice answered. "Micah?" Mr. Otis's voice was calm, reassuring. "What's wrong, son?" Micah's voice broke as he spoke, the weight of his fear spilling out. "Mr. Otis, it's my mum. She's in the hospital. I don't know what to do." There was a brief pause, and then Mr. Otis replied, his tone steady. "Stay where you are, Micah. I'll be there soon." As Micah sat in the cold, sterile waiting room, every second felt like an eternity. The low hum of hospital machines and the distant murmur of voices only heightened his sense of dread. He stared at his hands, which still trembled slightly, and he clenched them to stop the shaking. He was alone, and for the first time he felt the weight of it. The uncertainty gnawed at him. What if his mother didn't pull through? What if all his efforts had been for nothing? Just as he was sinking into these fears, he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Mr. Otis walking toward him, his face calm and filled with the steady resolve Micah had come to admire. Mr. Otis took a seat beside him, placing a reassuring hand on Micah's shoulder. "Thank you for coming, sir," Micah whispered, his voice tight with gratitude. "Of course, Micah. You don't have to go through this alone," Mr. Otis replied, his gaze steady and warm. "Any news yet?" Micah shook his head. "They just took her back. I don't know what's happening." Mr. Otis nodded, leaning back in his chair, his presence a quiet source of comfort. They sat in silence for a while, each minute stretching longer than the last. Finally, a doctor appeared in the hallway, scanning the room before his eyes fell on Micah. Micah jumped to his feet, his heart pounding. The doctor approached, his face serious but not unkind. "Are you Micah Rivers?" he asked gently. "Yes, that's me," Micah replied, barely able to keep his voice steady. The doctor glanced at his clipboard before meeting Micah's eyes. "Your mother is stable for now, but her condition has worsened. She'll need immediate treatment, and it may be a prolonged process. We're going to need to keep her here for a while." Micah felt relief wash over him, but it was quickly replaced by dread as the doctor's words sank in. "But how long? How serious is it?" The doctor hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Her illness has progressed, and while we'll do everything we can to help her, it's going to be a difficult journey. I'll give you more details soon, but I wanted to let you know she's stable. You can see her shortly." Micah nodded, too overwhelmed to respond. As the doctor left, he sank back into his seat, burying his face in his hands. His relief was mixed with worry about what this meant for the future, for the bills, for everything he'd worked so hard to keep together. Mr. Otis's hand rested on his shoulder once more. "Micah," he said softly, "whatever happens, you're going to get through this. You've been strong enough to make it this far." Micah looked up, his eyes filled with worry. "But how am I going to pay for this? We're barely making it as it is. I've been doing everything I can, but it's not enough." Mr. Otis was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I told you once that I might be able to help, and I meant it." He took a deep breath, meeting Micah's gaze. "I'm not just here to comfort you, son. I've been thinking about what you told me, about how much you're carrying alone. I think it's time you let someone else shoulder some of that weight." Micah's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Mr. Otis reached into his pocket, pulling out a pen and a small notepad. He scribbled something on the paper, then handed it to Micah. "That's the number for a close friend of mine, a lawyer who specializes in helping families get financial support for medical situations like yours, and I want you to consider something else." Micah looked at the note, feeling a strange mix of hope and caution. "What's that?" "Micah, I own several businesses. I don't always tell people that because I like to keep a low profile. But I've been watching you these past few weeks, and I see a young man who's committed, hard-working, and loyal. If you're willing, I'd like to offer you a part-time position in one of my offices. The pay would be better than the diner or the grocery store, and you'd work fewer hours." Micah stared at him in stunned silence. It felt like an answer to a prayer he hadn't dared to speak aloud. "I don't want to take away your pride, Micah," Mr. Otis continued, his tone gentle. "But sometimes life hands us help when we least expect it. And I'm offering because I believe in you." Micah felt his throat tighten, a flood of emotion rising up as he struggled to find the words. I don't know what to say. I didn't expect this. I don't even know if I deserve it." Mr. Otis smiled, patting his shoulder. "Son, sometimes the people who think they deserve it the least are the ones who need it the most. I don't expect you to decide now, but take the time to think about it." Micah nodded, overwhelmed but grateful. "Thank you, Mr. Otis. I'll think about it." Just then, a nurse appeared, signaling to Micah that he could see his mother. He gave Mr. Otis one last grateful look before following the nurse down the hall. Micah's heart thudded as he entered his mother's room, where the steady beep of monitors and the soft hum of machines filled the quiet space. Etta Mae lay on the bed, her face pale and tired, but her eyes opened as he walked in, a small, weak smile forming on her lips. "Micah," she whispered, reaching out a hand. He hurried over, taking her hand in his, squeezing it gently. "I'm here, Mama, I'm here." Etta Mae looked up at him, her eyes softening. "You didn't need to stay here all night, honey. I don't want you worrying." Micah forced a smile, though his heart felt heavy. "Of course I'm going to worry, Mama. You're all I got." She chuckled faintly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm tougher than I look, you know. You don't have to protect me." They sat in silence for a while, and Micah felt a lump forming in his throat as he watched her, seeing the toll her illness had taken. He didn't want her to see the fear in his eyes, so he looked down, fighting to keep his emotions in check. Finally, Etta Mae squeezed his hand, her expression gentle but serious. "Micah, if something happens, I need you to promise me something." Micah shook his head, unable to bear the thought. "Mama, don't say that. You're going to be okay." She gave him a faint smile, her gaze unwavering. "Maybe, honey, but life doesn't always go the way we plan. And if something does happen, I want you to go after your dreams, Micah. I don't want you to give up on your future because of me." Micah felt his throat tighten, a rush of emotions overwhelming him. "Mama, please, don't talk like that." "I'm just saying, baby, you're strong. You've got a fire in you, a light. Don't ever let that go, no matter what happens. You're going to do great things, Micah. I know it." He nodded, swallowing back the lump in his throat. "I promise, Mama. I'll try." As they sat together, he felt a strange sense of peace, as if her words had given him the strength he needed to face whatever lay ahead. The next day, Micah returned home alone, his mother still in the hospital under observation. The apartment felt emptier than ever, and he stood in the doorway, letting the silence settle over him. His exhaustion was a deep ache, but he knew he had a decision to make. He pulled out the business card Mr. Otis had given him and stared at it, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. Accepting help went against everything he'd taught himself in the past few years. But as he thought about his mother's words, about her dreams for him, he realized that maybe this was what she would want. The next morning, Micah dialed the number on the card, arranging to meet with the lawyer Mr. Otis had recommended. The lawyer listened to his story with patience and understanding, assuring him that there were ways to help his mother without compromising their future. Days later, Micah also accepted Mr. Otis's offer. His first shift at Mr. Otis's office was unlike any of his previous jobs. The work was challenging but not physically draining, and Mr. Otis took the time to show him around, introducing him to colleagues who greeted him with warmth and respect. As the weeks passed, Micah found a new rhythm. The financial strain began to ease, and he could finally breathe. His grades improved, and he had more time to study, his focus no longer split between school and survival. And every time he visited his mother at the hospital, he saw her health improving, her spirits lifting, and he knew he had made the right choice. In moments of quiet, when he was alone with his thoughts, he'd think back to those exhausting nights and the sacrifices he'd made, knowing they had all led him here to a life filled with hope he had almost forgotten was possible. Micah realized that while his journey had been difficult, it had shaped him, giving him the resilience and courage he needed to face whatever came next. Micah's days grew brighter, even as he continued adjusting to his new routine. Working fewer hours meant he could focus on school, something he hadn't been able to fully do in a long time. Yet as he regained balance, he still kept his guard up. He wasn't used to having things go his way, and a part of him was still braced for something to go wrong. One afternoon after school, he decided to visit the hospital before heading to Mr. Otis's office. The doctors had told him that his mother's condition was gradually stabilizing. He felt hopeful but cautious, knowing how quickly things could change. When he arrived at her room, he was greeted by the sight of his mother sitting up in bed, her face brighter than he'd seen in weeks. Her thin frame was still frail, but her eyes were lively as she saw him walk in. "Micah?" Etta Mae greeted him with a warm smile, reaching out for his hand as he approached the bed. "Look at you, all dressed up. You going to work?" Micah grinned, glancing down at the shirt and tie he wore for his new position at Mr. Otis's office. "Yeah, I'm just stopping by on my way there. Wanted to see how you're doing first." Etta Mae gave his hand a squeeze, her voice filled with pride. "You look so handsome, just like your father did when he went to work. I'm so proud of you, baby. You're doing big things." Micah chuckled, feeling his cheeks warm with embarrassment. "I'm just doing what I can, Mama." As they talked, he shared little stories from his day at school and from his job, telling her about the people he met and the things he was learning. She listened intently, laughing softly and nodding along, her presence a calming force. It was a moment of peace he wanted to hold on to, a glimpse of the life he'd always wanted for them both. They were in the middle of reminiscing about his childhood when a knock at the door interrupted them. Micah turned to see Mr. Otis entering the room, a friendly smile on his face. "Afternoon, Etta Mae," Mr. Otis greeted, his tone gentle as he approached her bedside. "I thought I'd drop by to check on you too. Hope I'm not interrupting." Etta Mae's face lit up as she looked from Mr. Otis to Micah, clearly delighted. "Not at all, Mr. Otis. Micah's told me so much about you. Thank you for looking after him." Mr. Otis smiled, giving her a warm nod. "It's been a pleasure. Micah's a fine young man. He's got a bright future ahead of him." Etta Mae squeezed Micah's hand, her gaze filling with a mixture of love and gratitude. "That's all I've ever wanted for him." Mr. Otis sat down, joining their conversation as they spoke about the plans for Micah's future. He talked about opportunities, about ways Micah could work and study at the same time, and Micah felt a wave of gratitude, a sense that his world was finally expanding beyond the tight circle of survival. They stayed like that for a while, the three of them sharing a rare moment of hope and connection. A few weeks later, Micah's routine had settled into something close to normalcy. His schoolwork was improving, he felt more rested, and his shifts at Mr. Otis's office had given him new skills and confidence he hadn't known he possessed. Althea, who had noticed his improvements at school, had been hanging around him more often, offering to help with class projects and even tutoring him in subjects he struggled with. One afternoon, as they were working on a science project in the library, Althea looked at him, her gaze curious. "You're different. You know that?" Micah raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Different? How?" "I don't know," she said thoughtfully, tapping her pencil against her notebook. "When I first met you, you seemed, I guess, closed off, like you were carrying something too heavy for one person." Micah nodded, not surprised that she'd picked up on that. "I guess I was." "And now?" she asked softly, her eyes searching his. Micah paused, considering his words carefully. "Now, things are better. It's like I can see a future." Not just for me, but for my mum too, for us both. Althea's face softened, and she reached out, resting her hand on his arm. I'm glad, Micah. You deserve it. You're one of the hardest working people I know, and I admire that. He felt a warmth spread through him at her words, a feeling of acceptance he hadn't felt in a long time. Thanks, Althea. I appreciate that. A lot. They shared a smile, a quiet understanding passing between them, and for the first time, Micah felt a genuine connection with someone his age. It was a simple moment, but to him it felt like a promise of something more, of friendships, possibilities, and a life beyond just surviving. One Saturday afternoon, as Micah finished up his shift at Mr. Otis's office, Mr. Otis called him into his private office. Micah entered, feeling a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. Mr. Otis sat behind his large oak desk, motioning for Micah to take a seat. Micah, I wanted to talk to you about something important, Mr. Otis began, his expression thoughtful. You've been working here for a while now, and I can see you've got a real knack for business. You're sharp, reliable, and you handle challenges well. Micah nodded, trying to hide his nervousness. Thank you, sir. I'm grateful for the opportunity. Mr. Otis leaned forward, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I know you're finishing up school soon, and I want to help you get to the next level. If you're interested, I'd like to sponsor you in a business management course. It would mean more study, but it could open a lot of doors for you. Micah's eyes widened in disbelief. A business course? He hadn't even considered such a possibility, not with everything he'd been through. But now, with Mr. Otis's offer, he felt a surge of hope, the idea of a real career becoming tangible. Really? Micah asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Mr. Otis nodded. Really, I believe in you, Micah. You've shown resilience and drive. Those are things money can't buy, and they're what make a great leader. A mixture of gratitude and determination filled Micah. Thank you, Mr. Otis. I'd be honored. I promise I won't let you down. Mr. Otis smiled warmly. I know you won't, son. This is just the beginning for you. The weeks that followed were filled with a whirlwind of new responsibilities and study. Micah balanced his part-time job with his schoolwork and his studies for the business course Mr. Otis had enrolled him in. It was challenging, but for the first time he felt a sense of direction, a vision for his future that went beyond day-to-day survival. One day, after a long week of work and study, Micah sat down with his mother, who had been discharged and was resting comfortably at home. Her health had stabilized, and although she still needed regular checkups, she looked better than she had in a long time. Etta Mae patted the couch next to her, smiling up at him with a familiar warmth. Tell me about what you're learning in those classes, baby. I want to know everything. Micah grinned, sitting down beside her and launching into stories about the lessons and projects he'd been working on. She listened intently, her eyes bright with pride as he spoke. For the first time in years, they were talking about a future filled with possibilities rather than just struggles. You're going to be something big, Micah, she said softly, reaching over to take his hand. I always knew it. Even when things were hard, I knew you'd find a way. Micah looked at her, a deep well of gratitude filling his heart. I couldn't have done any of this without you, Mama. You're the reason I'm here. She shook her head, her eyes glistening. No, baby, you did this yourself. You made it happen. And I know you'll keep making things happen. The world's just waiting for you. As they sat together, Micah felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known was possible. He realized that he wasn't just working for survival anymore. He was building something, creating a life he could be proud of, a life his mother could see and celebrate with him. The journey had been long, filled with more struggles than he could count, but now, as he looked ahead, he saw a future filled with hope. And in that moment, he knew he would do whatever it took to make that future a reality, for himself, for his mother, and for everyone who had believed in him when he hadn't believed in himself. As Micah settled into his studies and new responsibilities, his life began to take on a rhythm he hadn't experienced before, a balance between work, school, and a real sense of purpose. Etta Mae's health continued to improve with the care she was receiving, and Micah could finally see her smile returning, the worry lines on her face softening. He felt lighter than he had in years, but with every step forward, Micah knew there were still struggles to face. One Friday evening after his shift at Mr. Otis's office, he met up with Jeremiah at their favorite diner. As they slid into a booth, Jeremiah gave him an appraising look. "So big shot," Jeremiah teased, a grin spreading across his face. "What's it like being the kid with a job in an office? Got yourself a tie and everything?" Micah laughed, feeling a rush of pride, but also a bit of embarrassment. "It's different," he admitted, shrugging. "I'm learning a lot. Never thought I'd be doing something like this, but I guess it feels like a start." Jeremiah's smile softened. "Man, I'm happy for you, Micah. You deserve it. I know how hard you've been working." Micah paused, feeling the weight of all those long hours, late nights, and sacrifices he'd made. "Sometimes I wonder if it's real, you know? Like, things have been so rough for so long, it's hard to believe that things are actually getting better." Jeremiah nodded, his gaze serious. "I get that. But maybe it's time you let yourself believe in it. You earned this, Micah. Don't doubt it." As they talked, Micah shared stories about his days at the office, his projects in the business management course, and even his plans for the future. It was the first time he'd spoken about his dreams out loud, and with each word they felt more real. The sense of hope settled deeper within him, a quiet assurance he'd never known. A few weeks later, Mr. Otis approached him with another opportunity that surprised him even more. It was a Saturday morning, and they were working on an inventory project in the office when Mr. Otis came by Micah's desk, looking thoughtful. "Micah, I've got a little proposition for you," he said, his eyes glinting with a familiar warmth. Micah looked up, intrigued. "Sure, Mr. Otis, what's up?" Mr. Otis pulled a chair over, sitting across from him. "I'm expanding one of my businesses, a small store downtown that could use a fresh perspective. I'd like you to help manage it on weekends. You'll get a chance to apply what you're learning in your business courses." Micah's jaw dropped. "Manage? You mean like actually run the place?" Mr. Otis chuckled. "Yes, something like that. Don't worry, you'll have support." "But I trust you, Micah. You've shown me that you're responsible, smart, and hard-working. I think this could be the next step for you." A thrill of excitement rushed through him, mixed with nerves. "I'd love that, Mr. Otis. I don't know if I'm ready, but I'll do my best." "I know you will," Mr. Otis said, giving him a reassuring nod. "And remember, you'll be learning as you go. I'll be there if you need guidance, but I have every confidence you'll do great things." As Micah left the office that day, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. The thought of running a business, even on a small scale, felt like a dream he hadn't allowed himself to imagine. It wasn't just about earning money or supporting his mother. It was about creating something, proving to himself that he could rise above his circumstances. That weekend, Micah spent hours at the new store, familiarizing himself with the layout, studying inventory sheets, and learning from the team members already working there. It was challenging, but exhilarating, and he threw himself into it with the same dedication he'd shown in his other jobs. He quickly learned that managing a store was far more complex than he'd anticipated. There were employees to supervise, sales reports to complete, and customer service issues to address. But each challenge felt like a new puzzle to solve, and with every successful task, he felt his confidence grow. One afternoon, as he was organizing the store's back room, he noticed Althea enter, carrying a bag of supplies. She looked surprised to see him there, her eyebrows lifting in curiosity. "Micah? What are you doing here?" she asked, smiling as she walked over to him. Micah shrugged, a grin spreading across his face. "Guess I'm sort of managing this place now. Mr. Otis gave me the opportunity." Althea's eyes widened in admiration. "That's amazing! I knew you'd be doing big things, but I didn't think it would be so soon." Micah felt a surge of pride at her words, though he tried to play it cool. "It's still pretty new. I'm just trying to keep up and not mess anything up." "You won't mess up," Althea assured him. "You've got the work ethic, and you're learning every day. That's more than most people can say." They spent the afternoon chatting as she helped him organize the stock, and for the first time, Micah realized that his dreams weren't something he had to hide or downplay. He could be proud of his progress, share his accomplishments, and build a life that went beyond survival. Althea saw that potential in him, and her belief in him made him believe it too. But just as he was starting to settle into his new role, an unexpected setback shook his newfound confidence. The following week, the store faced an issue with its supplier. An essential delivery was delayed, leaving the shelves half-stocked just days before a big promotional event. Micah's mind raced as he realized the impact this could have on sales. His initial reaction was panic. He had never dealt with a crisis like this before, and he wasn't sure where to start. But then he remembered Mr. Otis's advice to take things one step at a time and to think creatively. Taking a deep breath, he assessed the situation. He called the supplier and managed to negotiate a partial delivery to cover the essentials, then reached out to local vendors to fill the gaps. It was a scramble, and the pressure was intense, but he refused to let his worry show. When the event day arrived, Micah watched with a mixture of pride and relief as the store bustled with customers, the shelves stocked and organized. Sales were strong, and he could feel the energy of success filling the room. Later that evening, as the store emptied and he wrapped up the day's reports, Mr. Otis stopped by to check in. He looked around the store, taking in the steady sales numbers and the neat shelves, then turned to Micah with an approving nod. "You handled yourself well today, Micah," he said, a gleam of pride in his eyes. "I heard about the supplier issue. You managed it like a true professional." Micah felt a swell of pride. "I just didn't want to let you down, sir. I wanted to make sure everything went smoothly." Mr. Otis gave him a warm smile, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You've proven yourself more than capable, and remember, challenges like these only make you stronger. You're learning skills here that will serve you for the rest of your life." As Micah left the store that night, he felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't known before. It was a small victory, but it meant everything to him. He was no longer just a boy struggling to survive. He was building a future, carving out a path that felt uniquely his. Over the following months, Micah's confidence continued to grow. His grades improved, his responsibilities at the store expanded, and he started saving for the future, both for himself and his mother. He even began considering colleges, a dream that once felt out of reach but now seemed possible. One evening, he sat with his mother on the worn couch in their apartment, sharing stories about his day and plans for his future. She listened with a proud smile, her hand resting on his as he spoke. "You know, Micah," she said softly, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "I always knew you'd do great things. I just didn't know how soon." Micah smiled, feeling a mixture of pride and gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mama. You taught me how to be strong, how to keep going." Etta Mae nodded, her voice filled with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, honey, and no matter where life takes you, just remember, you've already made it through the hardest parts." As they sat together, a deep sense of peace settled over Micah. His journey hadn't been easy, but each hardship had strengthened him, each sacrifice had shaped him. And now, as he looked to the future, he felt ready for whatever lay ahead. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living, building a life filled with hope, promise, and the unbreakable love that had guided him through it all. Micah's life was changing faster than he could have ever imagined. His role at Mr. Otis's store had turned him from a kid working odd jobs into a young man with real responsibilities, and every day he felt the weight of it, along with a growing pride he hadn't known before. His mother's health was stable, he had a steady job that paid well, and for the first time his future looked promising. One Saturday morning, as he was finishing the inventory count at the store, he received a text from Althea. "Althea, meet me at the park. I have something to show you." Micah was curious. Althea had always been a quiet presence in his life, encouraging him from the sidelines and sharing in his small victories. But today there was a spark of excitement in her message that intrigued him. The park was quiet, the golden leaves drifting softly to the ground as he walked along the winding path to meet her. Althea was waiting on a bench, her face lit up with a bright smile when she saw him. "Micah," she called, motioning him over. "Come sit. I brought something for you." Micah sat down beside her, smiling with curiosity as she handed him a small, wrapped package. He looked at her in surprise. "What's this?" "Just open it," she said, grinning. Inside the package was a hardcover notebook, its cover decorated with sketches of cityscapes and business icons. Micah ran his fingers over it, a warm feeling settling over him. He opened it to the first page, where Althea had written in elegant handwriting, "Micah's plans for the future." Micah's heart swelled. "Althea, this is incredible. I thought you could use a place to write down all those big ideas I know you have," she said softly. "You're doing so much, Micah. Sometimes it helps to see it all on paper, to remind yourself how far you've come and where you're headed." Micah smiled, feeling a rush of gratitude. "This is perfect. Thank you. I never thought of doing something like this, but it makes so much sense." They spent the rest of the afternoon talking about his ideas, his goals for the store, and even his dreams of one day opening a business of his own. Althea listened intently, her encouragement lifting him higher with every word. By the time they parted, he felt as though his dreams were no longer abstract hopes, but tangible goals he could work toward. As the months passed, Micah filled the pages of the notebook with everything he'd learned. He kept track of his savings, noted down tips from Mr. Otis, and even began drafting ideas for a small business he hoped to start someday, a combination bookstore and cafe that would serve the neighborhood with both warmth and a sense of community. One late evening, as he closed up the store, Mr. Otis approached him with a familiar, approving smile. "You've done well, Micah," he said, patting him on the shoulder. "Better than I could have asked for. You've turned this place around." Micah felt a rush of pride. "Thank you, Mr. Otis. I've learned so much here. I never thought I'd get the chance to do something like this." Mr. Otis nodded, looking thoughtful. "There's more I want you to learn. In fact, I've been thinking of giving you a bit more responsibility, something beyond this store." Micah's eyes widened. "More responsibility?" Mr. Otis chuckled at his surprise. "Don't look so shocked, Micah. You're ready? There's another location I want to open up in the next neighborhood. I'd like you to help me set it up from scratch. It'll give you experience in starting something new." Micah's heart raced with excitement. Starting a store from the ground up was a challenge he'd never dreamed of, but he knew he was ready. "I'd love that, Mr. Otis." "Thank you." Mr. Otis nodded. "We'll start planning next week. And Micah, remember this? You've got a gift for this work. Don't ever doubt that." The following week, Micah threw himself into the project with all his energy. He was involved in everything, scouting locations, deciding on inventory, and even managing initial staff hires. It was demanding work, but it felt like he was building something that truly mattered. Althea would stop by occasionally, lending her support and even helping him brainstorm for the new store's opening event. One evening, as they were wrapping up for the day, Micah shared with her an idea he'd been toying with. "I want the new store to feel different," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Not just another shop, but a place where people feel welcome, where they can come in, have a coffee, maybe read a book, like a second home." Althea's eyes lit up. "That sounds amazing, Micah. You could have local events, open mic nights, maybe even a section with local artists' work." Micah nodded, his excitement growing. "Exactly. I want to create something for the community. It's a long way off, but I think it's possible." Together they sketched out the idea in his notebook, the vision taking shape on the pages with every new idea. It felt like the beginning of something extraordinary, a dream he could almost touch. As the weeks went by, Micah continued to balance his work, studies, and responsibilities at the new store. One evening, as he returned home, exhausted but satisfied, he found his mother waiting up for him. Etta Mae's health had improved so much that she was able to walk around without her oxygen tank, and the color had returned to her cheeks. She watched him with a proud, gentle smile. "You've been working so hard, Micah. I can see it in you. You're going places." Micah sat beside her, feeling the familiar warmth of her love. "I just want to make sure we're okay, Mama. I want us to have something more than just getting by." Etta Mae reached over, resting a hand on his cheek. "And you're doing it, baby. You've already changed so much. Not just for us, but for everyone around you." They sat together in a comfortable silence, and Micah felt a peace settle over him. His life was no longer about surviving from one day to the next. It was about building, creating, and dreaming beyond what he'd ever thought possible. A few months later, the second store finally opened, and the turnout was greater than they'd hoped for. The community came out in full support, their warm smiles and congratulations filling the air. Mr. Otis watched proudly from the sidelines, and even Etta Mae made it to the opening, leaning on Micah's arm as they welcomed the customers together. It was a beautiful day, filled with laughter and hope, and as Micah looked around at the store he'd helped build, he felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. His life had taken a direction he'd never imagined, and he owed so much of it to the people who had believed in him, Mr. Otis, his mother, Jeremiah, and Althea. They had each been a part of his journey, helping him grow from a boy struggling to get by into a young man with a purpose. That night, as they closed up the store, Althea approached him with a shy smile. "Today was amazing, Micah. You really did it." Micah chuckled, still in awe of the day's success. "We did it. I couldn't have done any of this without you." She looked up at him, her gaze steady and warm. "You know, I think you're going to do a lot of great things, Micah, and I'd like to be there for them, if you'll have me." Micah felt his heart swell, and he reached out, taking her hand in his. "I'd like that, Althea. A lot." They stood there, hand in hand, the lights of the store glowing softly behind them, and Micah knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. In the months that followed, Micah continued to grow, learning and building on everything he had worked so hard for. The business expanded, and he managed both stores with a sense of purpose and pride. His mother's health continued to improve, and they moved into a small house just outside the neighborhood, a home they could truly call their own. Looking back, Micah felt a deep gratitude for everything he'd experienced, the hardships and the triumphs, each moment shaping him into the person he was becoming. He had built a life filled with love, community, and endless possibilities, a life he had fought for and won step by step. And as he looked to the future, he knew there was nothing he couldn't face. With his family, friends, and the dreams he'd worked so hard to create, Micah was ready for whatever lay ahead. As another year passed, Micah's life continued to unfold in ways he'd only dreamed of. The stores thrived under his care, becoming beloved community spaces filled with laughter, conversation, and the warm hum of people coming together. His hard work and commitment had paid off, and as he expanded his business knowledge, Micah felt the confidence of someone who'd found his calling. Etta Mae had grown stronger too, and she was now back to doing small things she loved, like singing on the weekends at a local jazz lounge. Her voice, still rich and soulful, drew crowds who came not only for the music, but for the spirit she brought to the room. It filled Micah with pride to see her reclaiming that part of her life, knowing that all his hard work had helped her get there. One evening, after a particularly busy day at the store, Mr. Otis invited Micah to dinner. They met at a cozy restaurant, where they had often talked about work and life, but this time Mr. Otis seemed different, almost as if he were reflecting on something important. "Micah," Mr. Otis began, setting down his fork, "I think it's time I officially step back from the business." Micah stared, surprise mixed with disbelief. "Step back? But Mr. Otis, you've built this from the ground up. It's your legacy." Mr. Otis chuckled, nodding. "That's true. But part of any legacy is knowing when to pass it on. I've been waiting for the right person, someone I can trust. And you, Micah, you're that person." Micah sat there, stunned, as the weight of Mr. Otis's words sank in. Are you asking me to take over the business?" Mr. Otis smiled, his eyes gleaming with pride. "I am. I believe in you, Micah. You've got the dedication, the intelligence, and the heart to keep this going and make it even better. I've watched you grow from a boy finding his way to a young man who knows exactly who he is. You're ready." Micah's mind raced, the reality of the offer, both thrilling and daunting. But as he looked at Mr. Otis, the man who had given him a chance when no one else had, he knew he couldn't turn this down. I don't know what to say," Micah finally replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But thank you. Thank you for everything. I promise I won't let you down." Mr. Otis reached across the table, clasping his shoulder. "I know you won't, Micah. You've already made me proud." When Micah returned home that night, he found Etta Mae waiting for him, her smile soft as she looked up from her worn copy of The Bluest Eye, a book she'd read so many times the pages had yellowed. "What's that look on your face, baby?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. Micah sat beside her, still feeling the awe of what had just happened. "Mama, Mr. Otis is retiring. He asked me to take over the business." Etta Mae's hand went to her mouth, tears welling up in her eyes. "Micah! Honey, that's wonderful. Oh, baby, I'm so proud of you." They embraced, and Micah felt the years of struggle, sacrifice, and resilience in her touch. This moment was as much hers as it was his, a testament to everything they'd endured and overcome together. "You did this," she whispered, her voice filled with pride. "You took everything life threw at you and you turned it into something beautiful. I knew you'd be great, but this is beyond what I dreamed." Micah held her hand, his heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mama. You taught me everything I needed to get here." They sat together, the quiet joy of the moment filling the small room, and Micah felt a deep peace settle over him. He had reached the dream he once thought was impossible, and he had done it with the love and guidance of the person who mattered most. In the following months, Micah settled into his new role as head of the business, tackling every challenge with determination. Althea was there by his side, a source of strength and encouragement, and they shared dreams of one day expanding beyond just 2 stores, of creating something even bigger together. One weekend, Micah hosted a celebration at the original store, inviting family, friends, and community members who had supported him from the beginning. Jeremiah gave a heartfelt speech about their years growing up, the long walks home, and the quiet dreams Micah had shared with him along the way. "I watched this man go from hustling 3 jobs to running 2 stores and now leading a whole business," Jeremiah said, his voice filled with pride. "Micah, you're an inspiration to everyone here. You're a reminder that no matter where you start, with enough heart, you can make it anywhere." The room erupted in applause, and Micah felt a warmth he couldn't describe. He looked around at the faces of those who'd been there for him, Mr. Otis, his mother, Althea, and so many others who had seen him at his lowest and believed in him even when he doubted himself. As he looked over at his mother, he saw her wiping away tears, her face a portrait of pride and love. She nodded at him, her smile radiating all the warmth and joy she'd held on to through the hardest times. Micah took a deep breath, feeling the strength of their journey come full circle. This was more than a celebration of success. It was a celebration of resilience, of love, and of the power of community. He raised his glass, looking at everyone with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady and clear. "Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Thank you for helping me see that anything is possible when you have people who care about you. This isn't just my success, it's ours." And as they raised their glasses, toasting to his future, Micah knew that he was ready for whatever lay ahead. He'd faced the darkness and had come out stronger, with a life filled with love, purpose, and endless possibilities. With his family, his friends, and his own unbreakable spirit, Micah was prepared to build not only a business, but a legacy that honored the past, embraced the present, and looked forward to a future as bright as the love that had guided him here.